In thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. My seminary preaching instructor was now a bishop. He was just doctor then. Ray Sutton. He's actually now the vice president of the Reformed Episcopal Church. And he had quite a different style in terms of what he wanted us to do than some of the other previous professors in our history. He was a big fan of John MacArthur's preaching style. I don't know how many of you have heard of John MacArthur. His preaching style is called expository preaching. It's a little different, and I can give you an example. Expository preaching versus maybe a thematic type of a sermon. If you have a theme, you would maybe come to church with an idea of, I want to preach about faith. And so you would look at different scripture references which would teach on the topic of faith and use those texts to support your sermon. Expository preaching is kind of the opposite. You start with a passage, or in our case, you're assigned a passage. Lectionary assigned passages for me. And then your job is to open up the passage and to teach what's there, regardless of what you initially thought you wanted to bring to the table. You kind of work backwards. You open it up and unpack what's inside. Another thing he was a big fan of is something called allegorical preaching. And he would use these in together. And allegorical preaching says that for any particular passage that you pick in the scriptures, especially when you're dealing with a narrative like our Old Testament lesson, you have a primary meaning, which is obviously there, the plain sense of the text. And beneath it, you have another message, and that's the message of the gospel. And he would actually challenge us to find a passage in the scripture which didn't have the underpinnings of the gospel supporting it all the way through the narrative. And that's what I wanted to walk through today as we look at the story of Mephibosheth, which is just a beautiful picture of God's gospel for us. There's a problem, however, and we probably all know this, that when we try to explain the gospel, we're going to look a little bit more at this in a couple of weeks, I think. But you think you present the gospel, you think it's clear, and then very often the other people don't seem to respond to it the way you expect them to. Unbelievers just can't seem to hear it sometimes. Give you a picture. This illustration was given to me a couple of years ago, and I find it to be an excellent picture. So you're driving down the road, and suddenly someone pulls up next to you where you're riding, and in the next car you can see somebody sitting there singing along to the music just as loud as they possibly can. And if you're having trouble picturing somebody, you can picture me or Nick, because whenever we're in the car and we're actually listening to music, we're always singing along if we know the words. Gabe will try to sing along too, and he'll just make up words because he usually doesn't know what they are. But there's few things I think just as amusing when you can look over and you see someone just singing with enthusiasm a song. And why does it look silly? Because your windows are rolled up and their windows are rolled up. When you look at them, you can tell they are just enthusiastically experiencing, hearing, and participating in something that you just don't get. To you, it looks really silly because you can't hear it, because you don't understand it. And I think the gospel often comes across that way to people. Some people, it's right in front of them, but they just can't get it. It seems obvious to us, and when we try to explain it to people, what seems obvious to us who are on the inside and clear and loud as can possibly be just looks ridiculous to those on the outside. They don't hear it, and they don't seem to get it. And you look at God's message of salvation to us, and I want to take this principle and look at Mephibosheth, because the gospel message to Mephibosheth was a surprise as we walk through the story. He was kind of shocked by the events that happened. And obviously, Mephibosheth is a really fun name. I quite enjoy when other people have to read a name like that, just like my favorite passage is to watch people read from Acts chapter 2, all the different towns everyone came from the day of Pentecost, Pamphylia and Phrygia, and I just get a big giggle as people try to stumble through all those different names. But deep down below the surface, it's not just a really sweet, nice story. Below the surface, it's really an incredible picture of God and His great love for us despite our unfaithfulness. So as we walk through this passage, and I'm going to walk through what we have in your bulletins, I want to give a little bit of background so we know what's going on. Jonathan was the son of King Saul, and most people here might know Jonathan. He was David's best friend. He was David's friend because David, after he slew Goliath, actually went and lived in the king's palace for a while. Not only that, but David actually became Jonathan's brother-in-law when he married Jonathan's sister. But a big problem arose, and that's because Saul chose to disobey the Lord. Saul was told his kingdom was going to be taken away from him. But that wasn't the bad part. The bad part was, he might have been able to live with that if he thought it was going to Jonathan. But it was going to be given to David. And Saul had a big issue with that. So Saul spent the next 10 years trying to make David's life as miserable as possible. He took his wife away from him. He kicked him out of the palace. He chased him all around the land. He basically declared civil war against one person, trying to set the whole nation to kill one person, the heir to the throne. He drove him into the land of the Philistines, and you can imagine how well David enjoyed living among the Philistines, given that he's the one who killed Goliath. So, David is away from home. His wife is gone. And it wasn't until Jonathan and Saul were both killed in battle against the Philistines that he was able to return home. And by right, he was to be now the king of Israel. So as king, what do you think David is going to do in retaliation to Saul's family, now that the throne is his? Well, Saul had a son left alive, and he had a grandson, Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. Both of these were possible heirs to the throne. So Saul's surviving son, we didn't really mention him too much, his name is Ishbosheth, that's another fun name. He decided to try to get some of the tribes to support him and declare war on King David and try to take the throne that was due to David. And he lasted about 7 years until he was finally murdered, and all the tribes recognized David as king. What about Mephibosheth? Well, he was 5 years old when Saul died. Obviously, he's not ready to plan out a great military strategy to attack David and take the throne away from David. In fact, his household, his caretakers were scared to death. Mephibosheth's family had, of course, been declaring war on David for over a decade and tried to kill him countless times. So, we have a boy, he's our main character, Mephibosheth here, who is by family lineage cursed because his family is at war with David. So on hearing about Saul and Jonathan's death, Mephibosheth's nursemaid decided she was going to take the boy and try to run him to safety. And we're told that as she was carrying him, either he was running alongside or she just tripped and fell, but she fell on top of him and broke his back. And so he ended up being partially paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life, from the age of 5 on. And we'll begin in our Bible passage from 2 Samuel chapter 9 with verse 1. This is about 10 years later after he had broken his back. Now David says, "Is there still anyone left in the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" So we begin with an amazing concept. We take it for granted because we hear it so much. But of mercy and grace when retribution is to be deserved. David had conquered the land by this time, which Saul was instructed to do and didn't do. And then after taking the throne from those who wanted to kill him, the first thing David tries to do is to reach out with love and mercy to the persecutors, to his persecutors for the last 20 or so years. Do you ever ask yourself, why does God show me kindness? And really kind of dwell on that thought. Our first parents, Adam and Eve, set us up in a lineage of sin. We have each one of us rejected our King. We've gone our own way because we want to be on the throne. And yet our King, for the sake of Jesus, shows us kindness and forgiveness rather than gives us the retribution that we deserve. Continuing at verse 3. Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in the feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lo-Debar." So we have a who and a where. When you're using the allegorical method, Dr. Sutton always told us, find out what the names mean. Sometimes they can be very helpful. Mephibosheth's name, not so much. Mephibosheth, we think, well, maybe it sounds nice in Hebrew. No. It means from the mouth of shame, or the spreader of shame. I don't know who would name their kid the spreader of shame, but that's where it is. That's where we find him. Lo-Debar is interesting, though, because Lo-Debar tells us that he's hiding out in the wilderness. It was basically a town, for those in Sunday school, and you remember your beautiful little map drawn on the board there. It's on the east side of the Jordan River, on the wrong side, right up by the desert. And it was a refugee town, which meant it was a town where outlaws went, where people who had bounties on their head went, where people who were in great trouble and trying to run away would go to hide out. And you can imagine it, I think the way I imagine it is always like a Wild West type of town, with loners coming into town who were trying to get away from all their troubles. That's why Mephibosheth was there. He was trying to get away from all his troubles. And when you picture Mephibosheth living there, he really doesn't fit in the other way. He's not one of those tough guys running away. On the other hand, he's quite the opposite. I would really, in my mind, I would picture him walking down the street. The people would know who he was. This guy was supposed to be the king of Israel. And here he is, a teenager, stumbling around the town on crutches. And I just picture them just yelling out, "Hey, hail the King of Israel! Here comes the King of Israel, everybody!" And snickering to themselves as this poor little boy tried to hobble his way down the road. It's something that would really crush your pride. It's something that would make you want to do really nothing more than just to get away from everyone. But he was as far away as he could. He was in the desert, basically, on the fringe of the wilderness. In verse 5, then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, and Mephibosheth came to David, fell on his face, and paid homage. Verse 7, and David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" So, if you watch TV, you know the answer to this. As David ascends his throne, what is the first thing that most kings, whether they're ancient kings, they're medieval kings, they're made-up kings on TV, do to secure their throne? Well, they cut off all the descendants of their rivals, so there's no more rivals for the throne. As a direct descendant of Saul, Mephibosheth knows this, and this is why he was out living in the wilderness. He says as much to David 10 chapters later in 2 Samuel 19, when David is returning after Absalom chased him out of town. He says to him, "All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord, the king." So Mephibosheth knows who he is. He knows that by his lineage, he is set against God's anointed. And it's interesting, I don't know how much to make of this, but the term he uses to describe himself is a dog. And if you go fast forward in time 1,000 years later, you have a Canaanite woman from almost the exact same area pleading with Jesus, who sees herself as a dog trying to get the scraps from under the master's table. He realizes his position, his lowliness, because of where he is and what's happened in his life. But we continue in verse 9. Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and says to him, all that belonged to Saul and all his house I have given to Mephibosheth. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table. And then the passage closes in verse 11. And Mephibosheth ate at the king's table like one of the king's sons for the rest of his life. So, in the first place, David restores Mephibosheth. He restores him all the land that was given him by his grandfather, that belonged to his grandfather, that was taken away because of his grandfather's sin. He blessed Mephibosheth with an honor that Mephibosheth had lost due to his lineage. Then David gives him servants. He restores this house. But most importantly, David gives him the most precious thing he could give him. He gives him the right to sit and eat at the king's table for the rest of his life, just like one of the sons of the king. For the rest of his life, he is to be treated as an adopted child of the king. David brings Mephibosheth to a place of honor, despite his disability, his infirmity, and despite his heritage. By seating Mephibosheth at the king's table, David gives him adoption as a child. So this is what the gospel is all about. I'm sure you're putting your pieces together here if you haven't already done so. The wrath of God is revealed against our ungodliness and the unrighteousness of men. But then God sends out his great invitation to us. David's call to Mephibosheth went forth in the form of responding to a covenant promise. And this is a promise that David made to Jonathan in 1 Samuel chapter 20. In verses 14 and 15 there, Jonathan makes David promise. And Jonathan says, but show me unfailing kindness like that of the Lord as long as I live, so that I may not be killed, and do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So David agrees to a covenant. And 3 times in 2 Samuel chapter 9, we find David, the undisputed king, because of his covenant promise, showing kindness and mercy to his enemies. And this is the great theme of the chapter, God's covenant mercy shown to his enemies, us, the Mephibosheth. But as I said when we began, this message can sometimes be hard for people to see. The biggest problem and the biggest hurdle we have to face when we don't understand the gospel is we don't want to embrace an understanding of the bad news in order to accept the good news. We can't accept the gospel until we accept our fallen, sinful nature. Not just because of our sin, our personal sin, but because of Adam and Eve's original sin. A lineage that has tainted our ability to even think properly. We want to see ourselves as God's friends, or at least acquaintances, at least maybe slightly estranged, but what we don't want to see ourselves is the reality of it. The reality that we are warriors trying to overthrow God and put either ourselves or our sins, our idols, our gods on his throne. Betty Doty, she was a lady friend of my mother's, and she shared with me at a Christian retreat, the Reformed Episcopal Church of Gainesville, Bishop Cummins' church. We were having a sharing time, and she shared with me that she went to church for 60 years before she understood the gospel. And she heard it preached all the time, but it was just like in the illustration, all of a sudden the window rolled down and it became clear for her. She said she literally got it when the preacher decided to preach a sermon, and its topic for the sermon was how nice old ladies are the hardest ones to reach with the gospel. She said it was literally that particular topic because in that particular sermon, the preacher addressed an understanding which was at her heart. He told her that nice old ladies are the hardest to reach because they know that they're really not all that bad compared to other people. They're pretty nice. They have good intentions. They think of themselves as having good motives. But it was a sermon directed directly to her, which helped her to realize that, not that bad isn't good enough for God. God doesn't allow any impurity. We are cursed by original sin, by the sin of our parents. We are cursed by our own individual sins. We are crippled spiritually in our bodies and our minds, and we'd like to make so many excuses for ourselves that they just don't hold water. But the good news is, for the sake of Jesus, our King lifts the curse that we're owed, like the curse was lifted from Mephibosheth. The King invites us personally to come and eat and drink at His table, a privilege we should have lost because of the curse. Not only that, but like Mephibosheth, we're blessed with an incredible inheritance. We are made sons and daughters of the King. No longer have to live as exiles out in the wilderness, but we are made as sons and daughters of our King, brought to His table to enjoy His fellowship forever. Let us pray.